There exists a peculiar relationship between consciousness and cannabis that goes far deeper than simple recreation or rebellion. When we examine the Jungian psychology of those who regularly use marijuana, we're not looking at a monolithic group with uniform motivations. We're examining a complex tapestry of human beings who've discovered in this plant something that speaks to a void within them, a disconnect, a hunger that conventional life fails to satisfy. Understanding the psyche of cannabis users through depth, psychology reveals truths about trauma, childhood wounds, and the architecture of consciousness that most people never fully grasp until they sit across from a skilled therapist who knows how to ask the right questions. The relationship with marijuana almost always begins in childhood, not the first time someone smokes, but in the original wound that creates the psychic structure that will later reach for the substance. Every person who develops a significant relationship with cannabis is attempting to solve a problem that was created long before they ever encountered the plant. This is what makes the psychology of marijuana use so fascinating and so tragic. The user believes they're choosing to alter their consciousness for pleasure or relaxation, but the unconscious knows better. The unconscious is trying to self-medicate a wound it cannot name. Consider the child who grew up in a home where emotions were dangerous. Perhaps there was an explosive parent, someone whose anger was unpredictable and terrifying. That child learned very early to become hypervigilant, to constantly scan the environment for signs of danger, to live in a state of perpetual anxiety. The thinking mind became overdeveloped as a defense mechanism. If I can just think through every possibility, predict every outcome, control every variable, maybe I can stay safe. This child becomes an adult whose mind never stops, whose thoughts race compulsively, who cannot relax because the old survival mechanism is still running, even though the danger has passed. When this person discovers marijuana, what they experience is not just relaxation. They experience something they've never felt before in their entire conscious life, the absence of hypervigilance. The racing thoughts slow down. The constant scanning for danger stops. The body, which has been held in a state of tension for decades, finally releases. This feels like coming home, like finally being able to breathe. The cannabis user doesn't understand their self-medicating complex PTSD. They just know that when they smoke, the suffering stops. Or consider the child raised by narcissistic parents, parents who could not see them as they truly were, who needed the child to be an extension of their own ego, a reflection of their success, a validation of their worth. This child learned to split off their authentic self and create a false self designed entirely around meeting the parents' needs and expectations. The true self, with its genuine needs, feelings, and desires, got buried so deep in the unconscious that the person lost all connection to it. They became an automaton, performing life rather than living it, achieving all the external markers of success while feeling hollow and dead inside. When this individual smokes marijuana, something extraordinary happens. The rigid structure of the false self temporarily loosens. Beneath the performance, beneath the achievement, beneath the carefully constructed persona, the authentic self stirs. Suddenly they can feel things. Suddenly creativity flows. Suddenly they remember what it's like to be spontaneous, playful, alive. They don't realize they're having a temporary reunion with the self they abandoned in childhood. They just know that cannabis makes them feel real in a way that ordinary consciousness no longer does. The trauma of emotional neglect creates a specific pattern in cannabis users. Children who were physically cared for but emotionally abandoned often develop what's called an anxious avoidant attachment style. They learned that their emotional needs would not be met, so they stopped having them, or more accurately, they stopped being aware of them. The emotional self went underground. These individuals often describe feeling numb, disconnected, like they're watching their life from behind glass. They go through the motions, but nothing touches them deeply. Cannabis, for this person, becomes a bridge back to feeling. Under its influence, music moves them to tears. Beauty overwhelms them. Connection with others feels possible. They're accessing the emotional function that their trauma forced them to shut down. But here's what they don't understand until someone skilled points it out. They're not creating new capacity for feeling. They're temporarily accessing capacity that was always there, but has been locked away by trauma. The work of healing isn't about smoking more cannabis. It's about doing the therapeutic work to safely reconnect with the emotional self that was exiled. The psychology of marijuana and the inner child reveals something crucial. Many cannabis users are unconsciously trying to give their inner child what it never received: permission to rest, to play, to not be productive, to just be. The child who was pushed to achieve, to be perfect, to never make mistakes, who was valued only for accomplishments rather than inherent worth, that child is still inside carrying impossible standards. Cannabis temporarily silences the harsh inner critic that's been internalized from childhood. It creates a space where the person can just exist without judgment, without pressure, without the constant demand to prove their worth. But this reveals a devastating pattern. The inner child doesn't actually need cannabis to feel safe enough to play. The inner child needs the adult they've become to consciously create that safety, to parent themselves in the way they were never parented, to offer themselves unconditional acceptance, gentleness, and permission to simply be. When cannabis becomes the only route to accessing this state, the person never develops their own internal capacity to nurture themselves. They remain dependent on an external substance to do what should be an internal function. The relationship between cannabis use and dissociation is profound and rarely discussed outside therapeutic settings. Dissociation is a trauma response where consciousness splits or fragments as a way of escaping unbearable reality. Children who experience trauma, especially ongoing trauma they couldn't escape, often developed dissociative capacities as a survival mechanism. They learn to leave their bodies, to go somewhere else in their minds, to not be fully present when reality was too painful. Many regular cannabis users are actually chronic dissociators who discovered that marijuana enhances their natural dissociative capacity. What they describe as relaxation or getting high is actually a deepening of the dissociative state they've been living in since childhood. They're not present in their bodies to begin with, and cannabis takes them even further away. This creates a vicious cycle. The more they dissociate, the more traumatic material remains unprocessed in their bodies. The more unprocessed trauma in their bodies, the more uncomfortable embodiment becomes. The more uncomfortable embodiment is, the more they need to dissociate. Cannabis becomes the tool that perpetuates the very problem it appears to solve. The shadow of the cannabis user, in Jungian terms, contains all the rage, grief, terror, and pain that's been too overwhelming to feel. Marijuana doesn't dissolve the shadow. It temporarily allows the conscious mind to coexist with the shadow without being flooded by it. The user can sense these darker aspects of themselves without being overwhelmed. This can feel like integration, like wholeness, but it's not genuine integration. Real shadow work, the kind that happens in deep therapy, involves slowly and safely bringing shadow material into consciousness, processing it, understanding where it came from, and genuinely integrating it into the personality structure. This is difficult, painful work that cannabis actually prevents by offering a shortcut that isn't real integration at all. Understanding the cannabis user through the lens of childhood attachment trauma reveals predictable patterns. Those with anxious attachment smoke to calm the constant anxiety about abandonment, the hypervigilance in relationships, the fear that everyone will leave. Those with avoidant attachment smoke to access feelings and connection they've defended against. Those with disorganized attachment smoke to regulate a nervous system that's fundamentally dysregulated, oscillating between anxiety and numbness with no stable center. What becomes clear in therapeutic work is that cannabis use is almost always an attempt at affect regulation, managing emotional states that feel unmanageable. People whose nervous systems were properly co-regulated in childhood by attuned parents don't need external substances to regulate their emotional states. They developed internal capacity for self-regulation. Cannabis users, almost universally, did not receive adequate co-regulation in childhood. Their nervous systems never learned to self-soothe, to down-regulate arousal, to find calm without external intervention. This is why simply stopping cannabis use without addressing the underlying nervous system dysregulation is so difficult. The person is flooded with emotions and sensations they have no capacity to regulate. This is where skilled therapeutic work becomes essential, learning somatic techniques, building distress tolerance, developing the internal resources that were never properly developed in childhood. Cannabis has been a primitive form of nervous system regulation. Healing means building sophisticated internal regulation that doesn't require external chemicals. The transgenerational transmission of trauma, also plays a role in cannabis psychology. Often the user's parents were themselves traumatized and never dealt with it. The anxiety, the dissociation, the inability to feel or regulate emotions, these aren't just personal issues. They're inherited patterns passed down through family systems. The cannabis user is carrying not just their own pain, but the unprocessed pain of their lineage. Understanding this doesn't excuse the behavior, but it provides crucial context for why the pull toward the substance feels so powerful and so necessary. The specific trauma of having an alcoholic or addicted parent creates a particular pattern in cannabis users. Children of addicts often swore they'd never be like their parents, never lose control to substances. Cannabis feels safer because it's not alcohol, not hard drugs. But what they don't see is that they're recreating the same pattern of using substances to manage unbearable internal states. The substance is different, but the underlying mechanism is identical. They're self-medicating pain just like their parents did, perpetuating the cycle they swore they'd break. The psychology of daily marijuana use reveals something about the unbearability of baseline consciousness. When someone needs to smoke every day, multiple times a day, they're telling you that their natural state of consciousness is so uncomfortable that they cannot tolerate it for extended periods. This isn't a moral failing. It's a red flag pointing to severe underlying issues, unprocessed trauma, undiagnosed mental health conditions, existential emptiness, spiritual crisis. The cannabis is a symptom, not the problem. The problem is what's making ordinary consciousness unbearable. In therapeutic work, when clients begin to explore what happens when they don't smoke, they often encounter what's been called the void. It's not physical withdrawal. It's the confrontation with everything they've been avoiding. The grief they haven't cried, the rage they haven't expressed, the terror they haven't faced, the emptiness they haven't acknowledged. Cannabis has been a lid on a boiling pot, and removing the lid means dealing with what's been suppressed. This is where many people fail and return to use, because facing the contents of the unconscious without support is overwhelming. The relationship between cannabis and unprocessed grief is particularly significant. Many users are carrying losses they never properly mourned. Perhaps a parent died when they were young, and no one helped them process it. Perhaps they experienced the loss of innocence through abuse or neglect. Perhaps they've lost versions of themselves that they had to kill off to survive. Cannabis creates a space where they can touch this grief without drowning in it. They can cry while high in a way they can't when sober. But this isn't the same as doing grief work. Real grief requires moving through it, not just touching it and retreating. The Jungian concept of the complex is essential for understanding cannabis psychology. A complex is an emotionally charged cluster of thoughts, feelings, and memories organized around a core wound. Cannabis users often have what we could call an inadequacy complex, a core belief in their fundamental unworthiness formed in childhood. Every experience gets filtered through this complex. Every interaction confirms their secret belief that they're not enough. Cannabis temporarily disrupts the complex's dominance over consciousness, creating relief from the constant inner criticism and self-judgment. But here's what skilled therapists understand. You can't dissolve a complex by avoiding it. You have to enter it, understand where it came from, feel the original pain that created it, and slowly rework the narrative. Cannabis prevents this work by offering temporary relief from the complex, without requiring the person to actually face and integrate the wounded material at its core. The user remains trapped in the complex, just with a chemical escape hatch that makes the prison more tolerable. The pattern of smoking to sleep reveals specific trauma patterns. Many users describe needing cannabis to turn off their minds enough to sleep. What they're describing is a hyper-aroused nervous system stuck in sympathetic activation, the fight-or-flight response that won't turn off. This is classic complex PTSD. The nervous system learned in childhood that letting your guard down is dangerous. Sleep becomes impossible without chemical intervention because the survival brain believes that being unconscious means being vulnerable to threat. The work of healing this requires slowly teaching the nervous system that it's safe to rest, that the threat has passed, that the childhood environment is not the current environment. This is somatic work, body-based trauma therapy, that gradually builds capacity for the parasympathetic response, the rest and digest state. Cannabis bypasses this developmental work, forcing the system into a relaxed state without building actual capacity for natural relaxation. Understanding the cannabis user's relationship with anger reveals crucial material. Many users describe never feeling angry, being peaceful and mellow. What this actually indicates is severe anger repression. The anger is there, buried in the shadow, but it's so threatening to the conscious personality that it must be kept completely out of awareness. Cannabis helps maintain this repression by mellowing out the system so much that even legitimate anger can't break through. These individuals often grew up in environments where anger was dangerous, where expressing anger brought punishment or abandonment. They learned to suppress it completely, and now cannabis helps them maintain that suppression. The therapeutic work involves learning that anger is not dangerous, that it's information, that it can be expressed healthily, that feeling it won't destroy relationships or prove they're bad people. But this work is nearly impossible while using cannabis regularly, because the substance prevents access to the very material that needs to be processed. The person must become willing to feel their anger, which means becoming willing to be uncomfortable, which means stopping the substance that's been preventing discomfort. The psychology of marijuana and sexuality reveals another layer. Many users report that cannabis enhances sexual experience, making them more present in their bodies, more able to feel pleasure, less inhibited. What this reveals is that in their baseline state, they're disconnected from their bodies and their sexuality. Often this disconnection stems from sexual trauma, from shame about sexuality learned in childhood, from body shame, from the general dissociation we've discussed. Cannabis temporarily bridges them back to embodied sensation and pleasure. But this creates a troubling dependency, where sex without cannabis becomes difficult or unenjoyable. The person hasn't actually healed their relationship with their body or their sexuality. They've found a chemical bridge that allows temporary access. Real healing would involve therapeutic work around the original wounds, slowly building capacity for embodied presence and pleasure without external aids, reclaiming sexuality as a natural expression of their being rather than something that requires chemical mediation. The final piece that emerges in deep therapeutic work is the spiritual dimension. Many cannabis users are mystics without a practice, individuals with a natural capacity for expanded consciousness and connection to the numbness who found in cannabis an accessible doorway to these states. In indigenous cultures, they might have been shamans or healers or visionaries. In our culture, with no legitimate pathway for these capacities, they self-medicate their spiritual hunger with a plant that offers at least a taste of transcendence. The tragedy is that cannabis spirituality remains superficial without the container of genuine practice, lineage, and integration. The insights received don't transform daily life. The expanded states don't lead to expanded being. The person oscillates between mystical experiences while high and mundane consciousness while sober, never integrating the two. Real spiritual development requires discipline, practice, and the willingness to do the difficult work of transformation. Cannabis offers the experience without the transformation, leaving the user perpetually seeking the next high rather than becoming the expanded consciousness they've glimpsed. What becomes clear through all of this is that cannabis use, particularly chronic use, is not random or recreational. It's a response to deep psychic wounding, an attempt to self-medicate trauma, regulate a dysregulated nervous system, access split-off parts of the self, and find relief from unbearable internal states. The plant itself is neutral. The relationship reveals everything about the user's psychological structure, their childhood wounds, their unmet needs, their dissociated material, their spiritual hunger. Understanding this doesn't mean judgment. It means compassion for the suffering that drives the use and clarity about what real healing requires, not abstinence alone, but the difficult, brave work of turning toward the wounds, feeling what's been unfelt, integrating what's been split off, processing what's been avoided, and slowly building the internal capacities that were never properly developed. In that work lies the possibility of genuine freedom, not from discomfort, but from the compulsive need to escape from yourself, and the discovery that the expanded consciousness you've been seeking through cannabis has been inside you all along, waiting to be reclaimed through the hard-won work of becoming whole.